I cannot tell you if it was Tuesday or Wednesday. The days had lost their names by then, bleeding into one another like ink spilled on wet paper. All that remained was the mud. It was a cold, hateful slurry that seemed to resent our presence in the Apennines as much as we resented the Germans. I remember the temperature, though. That memory lives in my joints even now, 70 years later. It was a damp chill that ignored the wool of my coat and gnawed directly on the bone. I was lying flat in a ravine, the smell of rotting chestnuts and wet limestone filling my nose. Above me on the ridge, they passed a German patrol. A soldier listens for the cadence of boots or the rattle of equipment, but a farmer listens to the land. I didn't need to see them to know they were frightened. They walked too heavy. They stepped on the dry wood instead of the moss. They were fighting the mountain, and the mountain was winning. I watched their gray uniforms through a gap in the ferns, noticing how the fabric bunched at the knees. Stiff with grime, they looked like blight on a healthy crop. It is strange how the mind retreats when the body is in peril. As I lay there, waiting for the bullet that might find my back if I breathed too loud, I was not in the mountains of the Gothic line. I was back in the Val d'Orcia. The sun there is different. It is heavy, like a warm hand resting on your shoulder. I could smell the olives, the sharp, peppery scent of the press in November. I could feel the vibration of the thresher in the soles of my feet, a rhythm that was the heartbeat of my family for 300 years. My father used to say that the soil remembers everything. If you treat it with anger, it yields nothing. If you treat it with patience, it feeds you. The Germans, they treated Italy like a whore, taking what they wanted, leaving bruises. I remember looking at my hands in that ravine. They were caked with filth, the fingernails black and split. These were hands meant to prune vines, to cradle the soil, to guide the birth of a calf. Now they held a submachine gun that felt greasy and alien. It was a tool of subtraction, and I was a man built for addition. The patrol passed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, pregnant with the threat of their return. I shifted, the mud sucking at my elbows. This was the fear, not the dying. Dying is simple. It is the final harvest. The fear was the living. The fear was the capture. I had heard stories from the villages near Marzabotto. I knew what they did in the basements of the villas they requisitioned. They had tools. They had time. My mind drifted to Enzo, my brother. The last time I saw him, he was wearing the black shirt of the RSI, the fabric ill-fitting on his boyish frame. He didn't look me in the eye. They had taken him, conscripted him like cattle, and twisted his mind until he marched to their drum. The thought of him was a jagged stone in my gut. If they caught me, if they put the wires to me, or the water, would I speak? Would I give up the location of the safe house in the valley? Would I trade the lives of 20 men to stop the pain? I told myself I was strong, like the old oak at the edge of our property. But even oaks break in the storm. I didn't trust my memory then, and I don't trust it now. But I remember the taste of bile. The signal came as a low whistle, mimicking a thrush, though a real thrush would never sing in that weather. It was Il Lupo, the wolf, our liaison. I crawled backward, sliding down the shale until I reached the overhang where the others waited. The cave smelled of unwashed bodies and damp tobacco. A small fire struggled against the draft, casting long, dancing shadows that made the men look like specters. The captain was there. He didn't look up when I entered. He was staring at a map spread out on a crate. "Rossi," he said. His voice was gravel. "We have a problem." He pointed to a spot on the map, a cluster of buildings near Monticino, a supply depot, fuel, ammunition, spare parts for the Panzers holding the line. "They are moving a shipment in 3 days," the captain said. "If that fuel reaches the front, the Americans will bleed for every inch of the pass. We need someone inside." He looked at me then. His eyes were tired, rimmed with red. "You know the dialect. You know the farms around there. You can walk like a peasant because you are one." A refusal sat on my tongue. I wanted to tell him I was a farmer, not a spy. I wanted to tell him about the shaking in my hands when the shelling started. I wanted to tell him about Enzo, that my war was personal, not strategic. But then I looked at the map. I saw the lines drawn in pencil, cutting across the land I loved. They were carving up my home. What do I need to do? I asked. The voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded hollow. Get in, he said. Map the fuel stores. Mark the structural weaknesses. Get out. We blow it when the convoy arrives. He handed me a piece of paper, a crude drawing of the depot's interior based on rumors and observation. I took it. The paper was rough, poor quality. I held it near the dying flame. The light flickered, illuminating the ink lines that represented walls, gates, guards. It looked like a trap. It looked like a grave. I nodded once. The movement felt stiff. I stared at that map, the firelight reflecting in my eyes, burning the image into my brain. I was no longer Marcello, the farmer. I was something else, something darker. The darkness of the cave seemed to close in, swallowing the man I used to be. One foot, then the other. You are nothing. You are dirt. The checkpoint was a wooden barrier across the road, manned by 3 soldiers and an officer. They looked bored, which made them dangerous. Boredom makes men cruel. I joined a small line of laborers, men and women with hollow cheeks and eyes that looked at nothing. When it was my turn, the officer stepped forward. He was young, his face unlined, but his eyes were old. He held out a gloved hand. Papers. I handed him the forged documents. They felt flimsy in the air. He scanned them, then looked at me. He looked at my boots, caked in the mud of the high peaks. You are from the north, he asked, his Italian accented, clumsy. Valdorcia, I lied, keeping my voice low, thick with the dialect of the hills. I came for work. The harvest is poor. He stared at me for a long time. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a roaring sound like a waterfall. I thought of the knife hidden in my boot. I thought of how quickly I could reach his throat. But that was the soldier thinking. The farmer waited. The officer grabbed my hand, turning it palm up. He ran his thumb over the calluses, the thick, rough skin built by years of handling the hoe and the scythe. He sneered, dropping my hand as if it were something unclean. Go, he said, waving me through. Work. I shuffled forward, not too fast. Relief washed over me, cold and dizzying. I had passed the test. My life was my disguise. A few yards past the barrier, a woman was adjusting a basket of kindling. She looked at me. She didn't smile, but she reached into her apron and handed me a small heel of bread. It was dry and hard. Our fingers brushed. In her eyes I saw the same fear I felt, and the same hatred. It was a silent communion. We were allies in the kingdom of the occupied. The depot loomed ahead. It was a sprawling complex of warehouses and requisitioned barns, surrounded by high fences topped with wire that gleamed in the morning light. The noise was deafening now, shouting engines, the clatter of metal crates being stacked. It was the sound of a machine eating the world. I fell in with a group of workers marching toward the main entrance. We were cattle. We were fuel for their war machine. As we passed under the archway, the shadow fell over me. It was colder here. Behind me, the heavy steel gates swung shut. There was a sound of finality, a massive, reverberating impact of iron against iron that shook the ground beneath my feet. I didn't look back. I was inside the beast's belly now, and the digestion had begun. I lowered the crate near the fuel drums, the wood scraping against the concrete floor. My muscles burned not from the weight, but from the tension that coiled around my spine like a wire garrote. The air here was thick with the chemical stench of diesel and the metallic tang of grease. It tasted like the city, like industry, like death. I wiped my brow with a dirty rag, my eyes darting left, then right. The depot was a hive. German mechanics shouted over the roar of engines, their voices sharp and guttural. Trucks idled, coughing black smoke into the stagnant air. I was invisible here. Just another pair of hands, a beast of burden with dirt under his fingernails. I moved toward the primary tank. It was a massive steel cylinder, sweating condensation in the morning heat. This was the artery. Cut this, and the blood flow to the Gothic line stops. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the timer. It was a simple device, clockwork and fuse. Crude but effective. I needed 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds to wedge it between the valve and the intake pipe. Then I saw them. A patrol rounded the corner of the supply shed. They were not wearing the field gray of the Wehrmacht. They wore black. The Black Brigades. Italians. My countrymen who had sold their souls to the occupier. I felt the familiar rise of bile in my throat. The hatred I nursed like a sick animal. They were laughing, sharing a cigarette, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were boys mostly, conscripts dragged from their villages, forced to wear the shirt or face the wall. One of them turned to catch a lighter thrown by his comrade. The sunlight hit his face. The world narrowed down to a pinprick. The noise of the depot, the roar of the trucks, the shouting, it all vanished into a vacuum of silence. It was Marco. He looked thinner than I remembered. His uniform was too big, the collar hanging loose around his neck. He looked tired. There was a smudge of grease on his cheek, right where our mother used to kiss him. He was smoking, holding the cigarette with his thumb and forefinger, just like our father did. He was standing 3 meters from the fuel tank, 3 meters from the spot where I was about to plant the fire that would consume this place. My breath hitched, a jagged shard of air in my lungs. I froze, my hands still in my pocket, clutching the death I had brought for him. He was laughing at something the other soldier said, a flash of white teeth in a weary face. He didn't know. He didn't know his brother was standing 10 paces away, dressed as a peasant, holding his execution order. The mission was clear. The intelligence was vital. The partisans on the mountain were waiting for the smoke. If I failed, the tanks would refuel. They would roll up the Kasha road. They would kill the unit. They would burn the safe houses. But this was Marco. I taught him to tie his boots. I held him when he broke his arm falling from the hayloft. I promised our mother I would watch him. A German officer strode into the courtyard, barking orders. The laughter died. Marco and the others snapped to attention, their backs stiff, fear replacing the fatigue in their eyes. The officer pointed at the fuel tanks, then at his watch. They were preparing for inspection. The window was closing. It was now or never. I watched the officer berate them. I saw Marco flinch. If I detonated the charge, the blast would vaporize the tank. It would take the trucks. It would take the officer. It would take the boy standing at attention with the ill-fitting collar. My hand trembled. The timer felt heavy like a stone. If I walked away, I saved him, but I damned 100 others. I damned the cause. I damned the very land I was trying to liberate. Marco looked up. His eyes scanned the yard, glazing over the workers. For a second, his gaze swept over me. He didn't see a brother. He saw a dirty laborer. He looked through me. I gripped the fuse. My knuckles turned white. I could feel the pulse in my wrist, hammering against the metal. The officer turned his back. Marco adjusted his rifle. He was so close I could see the fraying thread on his epaulette. I had to choose, the soldier or the brother, the patriot or the man. I stepped forward, my boots heavy as lead. I knelt by the valve, pretending to scrub a stain on the floor. I pulled the timer out. I set the delay. 10 minutes, enough for a fast runner, not enough for a sentry on guard duty. I looked at him one last time. He was looking at the sky, perhaps thinking of the farm, of the wind in the cypress trees. I pulled the pin. The explosion did not sound like a noise. It felt like a shovel striking the earth of my own grave. I was already outside the perimeter, scrambling up the scree of the ravine when the world turned white. The ground bucked violently, throwing me into the dirt. A wave of heat rolled over the hillside, stripping the leaves from the scrub oak, hot and terrible as the breath of hell. I didn't look back. I lay in the dirt, my hands over my head, while the shockwave rattled my teeth. Debris rained down, shattered concrete, twisted metal, burning rubber. It sounded like hail on a tin roof. I lay there for a long time. The smoke rose in a black pillar, staining the perfect Tuscan blue. I should have felt triumph. I should have felt the satisfaction of a job done, of a blow struck against the tyrant. But I felt only cold, a deep hollow cold that the burning fuel could not touch. I crawled deeper into the woods, moving like a wounded animal. I made my way back to the hideout, navigating the goat paths by muscle memory. The other partisans were waiting. They saw the smoke. They cheered when I emerged from the brush. They clapped my back. They offered me wine. "Did you see the secondary explosions?" the commander asked, his eyes shining. "We heard the ammo cook off from here. Magnificent, Rossi. Magnificent." "It is done," I said. My voice sounded strange, raspy, as if it belonged to a dead man. "The depot is gone. I never told them. I never told anyone. I returned to the farm after the war. The Germans were gone. The fascists were gone. The land was ours again. I walked the fields that had been requisitioned. The soil was hard, packed down by tank treads and heavy boots. It took me years to break it up again, to coax the olives back from the gray wood. I am an old man now. The sun is warm on the terrace. The valley is green. Tourists come to take pictures of the light, of the rolling hills. They say it is paradise. They do not see the bones beneath the wheat. I never found out. There was no body to bury, just a name on a list of the missing. Sometimes in the dark, I tell myself he ran. I tell myself the officer dismissed them just before the blast. I tell myself he is alive somewhere, an old man like me, drinking wine in a square in Milan or Rome. But I know the truth. I am a farmer who knows his seasons. You cannot plant fire and harvest life. We fight for family, for our home, but war forces you to destroy the very things you love. The real enemy is not the man in the other uniform. The real enemy is the choice it makes you face. A choice between your brother and your country. There is no right answer. There is only the living with it. I look at my hands. They are spotted with age, trembling now just as they trembled that day. They have tilled the earth. They have held my children, but they are the hands that pulled the pin. The machine is broken forever. The harvest is ruined. I plow the fields, but nothing grows in the soil of my heart but weeds and silence. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.